Rain ran through the torn seam at Barbara McCarthy's shoulder and slid down her spine in a slow, cold line that made her teeth press together. The hackney lurched from Mayfair towards St. James, over stones slick with afternoon weather, and each jolt drove the corner of a hat box deeper into her thigh. She held it steady with one hand. The other hand gripped a basket of mended kid gloves that smelled of damp wool and starch, though the fine ladies who owned them would later praise only the stitching and never ask whose fingers had split at the knuckles to do it. Mud from a passing wheel struck the door panel. Someone outside laughed. Through the clouded glass she saw 3 gentlemen under a portico turn to look as the carriage passed, first at the crest painted on the side, then at the pale, dark-haired girl, in a dress that had gone nearly transparent at the sleeves. Their eyes lingered, their faces altered by a degree and no more. By the time the horse slowed again, her hem was wet to the knees, her stomach had cramped twice from hunger, and the crust she had tried to swallow at dawn still sat like chalk in her throat. The driver hauled open the door without offering his hand. Barbara climbed down with the hat box balanced against her ribs, the glove basket hooked over her wrist, and rain striking her lashes so hard she had to blink between steps. The assembly hall rose before her in white stone and soot, lamps already lit against the grey. A footman in Wrexham livery stood under the awning, dry as polished wood, and looked at her as if she were a package delivered late. "Mrs. Wrexham says you are tardy and useless," he said, not softly, because 2 ladies in blue silk were passing and could hear him. The ladies did hear. One glanced at Barbara's sleeves and then away, the way people looked away from spilled slop in a street. She adjusted the basket on her wrist. Her fingers burned where cold had cracked the skin around the nails. "Tell Mrs. Wrexham I came as quickly as the weather allowed," she said. He gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "I was told to repeat the message exactly, Miss McCarthy. Nothing more." Inside, heat gathered under the chandeliers but did not reach the vestibule, where draughts moved under the doors like water. Barbara stood against the wall, while carriages unloaded names that mattered. She took gloves from the basket 1 pair at a time, checked each seam, turned each cuff, and folded them into the hat box so the crushed brim could dry with shape intact. Her hands shook once from cold, and she stilled them by pressing her thumb hard into the base of her palm. Men in dark coats crossed the floor in measured strides, speaking of committees, subscriptions, and harvest projections. Women in silk moved in rustling colour, their laughter bright and brief, their perfume layered over coal smoke and wet wool. No one asked her why she stood in service at an event where she had once entered at her father's side. 3 years had been enough to erase that memory from everyone but her. When Mrs. Wrexham swept in, lavender arrived before her, then the narrow line of her mouth, then the 2 daughters at her shoulders like mirrors tilted toward admiration. Their gowns were lilac and cream. Their gloves were from Barbara's basket. Mrs. Wrexham did not pause. "There you are," she said, and the words carried the same irritation one might use for a broken clasp. "My husband's plain child has been hiding in the doorway. Do not stand so near us. You draw damp into the fabric." A gentleman nearby inclined his head to Mrs. Wrexham and let his gaze slide over Barbara without interest until she lowered her eyes. Then he looked again, puzzled by something severe in her stillness. She knew that look. She received it often and never safely. Plain, they said, because plain was easier than admitting what did not fit the market of pretty faces and practiced smiles. Yet her eyes were too large to disappear, and the thinness of her face gave each expression a sharpness she could not soften even when she tried. She followed 3 paces behind as they moved toward the cloak alcove, carrying shawls that were not hers and taking instructions she had heard each week since Lent. Hold this, fetch that. Mend this before Thursday. Do not sit where guests can see you. Mrs. Wrexham spoke in a low voice meant to resemble correction, and landed as contempt. One daughter asked whether the pearls would be noticed beneath gaslight. The other asked whether Lord Ashcombe preferred French lace. Barbara answered when spoken to and did not look up. The servant's stool near the wall stood empty. She did not take it. Standing kept the blood moving. Standing also reminded everyone what she had become. Her father had died in January, in the third winter of failed rents and rising grain. She had been 19 and still believed numbers could save a household if one worked long enough and told the truth early enough. He left ledgers dense with neat figures, letters tied in blue ribbon, and debts whose interest multiplied while mourners were still in black. 6 months later, her mother followed him into the churchyard with a fever that burned through 2 nights and did not break. Mrs. Wrexham arrived soon after with claims of efficiency, with keys on a silver ring, with a lawyer who spoke of necessary settlements and prudent reallocations. Barbara's dowry vanished into those words. Cabinet locks changed. Her father's study was emptied in an afternoon. The globe she had turned with him each Sunday went to an upstairs schoolroom for children, who never opened an atlas. By autumn, she slept in a narrow attic room under loose slate and kept her shoes lined with folded paper against damp that rose through cracked soles. By morning, she endured by measure. 1 cup of tea stretched over 2 tasks. 1 candle divided between mending and copied columns for a printer on Fleet Lane who paid in coins too small to mention. 1 hour before dawn to read her father's shorthand notes on tenancy law, hidden in a flour tin under old receipts. She could read an account book faster than most stewards and spot a false carry line in half a page, but skill had no market for a young woman, without patronage, and without money to leave a cruel house. She knew what deference cost. She also knew what speech cost. Her father had taught her one discipline at a writing table scarred by years of honest use: never speak unless truth would cost less than silence. Since his death, silence had been cheaper most days. A bell rang twice. Guests began to move toward the lecture room. Barbara remained in the vestibule to scrape dried wax from a borrowed candlestick and wrap it in paper for the return basket. Her nails were rimmed black from soot. The skin over her right knuckle had split clean across and reopened each time she bent her hand. A maid from another household paused beside her long enough to whisper, "You are bleeding," then walked on before kindness could be noticed. Barbara tucked her hand into her sleeve and finished wrapping the candlestick. She had long ago learned that pain became easier when given a task and a number. 6 gloves to sort, 3 ribbons to rethread, 2 hems to turn before midnight, 1 mistake and no supper. By the 2nd week of June she could tell which tradesmen would cheat by the way they addressed her. Miss McCarthy when they wished to flatter. Girl when they wished to underpay. She could also tell which acquaintances would pretend not to know her in public and send notes to the house for copied invoices at half their proper rate. Tonight 2 such women passed within arm's reach and discussed her as if she were a fold in drapery. "The elder one," said the first, not lowering her voice. "Useful hands, no prospects." The second gave a soft laugh. "Mrs. Wrexham is charitable to keep her." Barbara kept her face still and adjusted the hat-box ribbon. Her pulse beat hard for 10 breaths and then settled. Anger required food. She did not have enough in her to waste it. A draught moved down the corridor colder than before. Somewhere deeper in the building a door opened and a cluster of men spoke at once, low and controlled, the tone of those accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Wrexham turned her head toward the sound. Calculation sharpened her features. She beckoned without looking at Barbara.
"Come here!"
Barbara crossed the tiles and stopped at the correct distance. Mrs. Wrexham's gloved hand tapped the brim of her own hat once, then twice. "You will remain useful for 1 hour, perhaps 2, if you keep your wits. Do not embarrass me tonight." One daughter smirked at the phrasing. The other adjusted a bracelet and did not meet Barbara's eyes. Barbara inclined her head. "Yes, ma'am." The lecture doors opened in a sweep of polished wood. Warmth and light spilled into the vestibule, carrying chalk dust, wet coats, and the metallic scent of lamp oil. Barbara stepped aside as guests entered in rank and colour, each announced by name or title, each absorbed into a room where voices would decide grain and rent, and the shape of winter for people who would never be invited beneath those chandeliers. She stood with the hat box and the glove basket, and waited until the last silk train cleared the threshold. Then she followed at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed except when someone needed an item carried. Her shoulders ached, her hands stung, her stomach was hollow enough to feel cleanly cut. At the back of the room, where servants and lesser relations stood without chairs, she placed the basket on the floor and folded her cracked fingers together to hide the tremor. On the dais, clerks arranged stacks of ledgers bound in red. Candlelight struck gilt frames and made the figures on the walls appear watchful. Mrs. Wrexham did not turn to see whether Barbara had found a place. She did not need to. Barbara was always where she was told to be, unless truth demanded a price she could no longer pay. Tonight, with rain still drying in her sleeves and hunger biting behind her ribs, she fixed her gaze on the nearest ledger and listened for the first number spoken aloud. The first figure came from the dais in a clerk's thin voice, then a second, then a third, each spoken with the confidence of men who had never measured hunger by ounces. Barbara listened and felt the old discipline settle over her shoulders, like a mantle she had not chosen but had worn so long it had taken her shape. Rent roll, deferred levy, seasonal adjustment. The words moved through the hall under crystal light, while rain tapped at the high windows and ran in threads down the glass. She could hear the scratch of quills from the front benches. She could hear the rustle of silk where Mrs. Wrexham and her daughters sat 2 rows from the aisle, bright as painted porcelain, fed and warm and alert only when a title was announced. Barbara stood at the back with the servants and poor relations, and numbers lined themselves in her mind without effort, each column finding its pair, each sum carrying cleanly until one did not. She had learned that rhythm at her father's side before she had learned to dance. He would spread ledgers across the library table after supper, loosen his cravat, and ask her where the steward had hidden his error. She had been 14 the first time she found one. She had been 15 when he handed her his own pen and said with quiet pride, "Again." There had been lamplight on polished wood. There had been bread still warm from the kitchen. There had been a house where she belonged in every room. Debt came slowly at first, as weather came slowly before a flood. One failed harvest, then another, then repairs delayed, then creditors polite enough to sound sympathetic while sharpening terms. Her father sold timber rights, then horses, then silver that had belonged to Barbara's grandmother. He never sold the tenant grain reserve. He refused that line each winter, even when his own hands shook at breakfast, and he pretended not to notice the thinness in her face. "Land is responsibility," he told her, when she asked why they had no coal in the East Wing that year. "Not ownership. Remember that when everyone around you says otherwise." She remembered it now while men in tailored coats discussed Brackenfell as an inconvenience, not a village. She remembered it while her stomach cramped behind her stays, and she pressed one palm against the basket handle until pain steadied her. On the dais, a committee member praised prudent reductions. The phrase was neat. The meaning was brutal. Barbara kept her gaze lowered because if she watched their mouths shape those words, she would not trust herself to remain silent. Mrs. Wrexham had entered their lives on an April afternoon, with a rosewater scent and a widow's composure that did not survive her first month under their roof. Barbara had been too young to understand why her father's voice grew careful around that woman, why invitations multiplied, why bills from modistes arrived in thick folded packets when the stable roof still leaked over 2 stalls. Afterward, when she had enough age to name what she had seen, it felt less like memory than arithmetic. Mrs. Wrexham came with charm, then with grievance, then with insistence. Her daughters arrived with trunks, governess, lapdog, and the easy certainty of girls trained to consume a place as if they had built it. Barbara's own mother had still been alive then, weakened by a cough that never mended, keeping to her chamber and thanking everyone who entered as if gratitude could pay for medicine. In that year, Barbara learned how a household could split in plain sight without a single door being slammed. Her father ate in his study more often. Her mother slept through afternoons she once spent in the music room. Mrs. Wrexham sat at the head of dinner and corrected the servants by name before she had bothered to learn the tenant families beyond the gate. When her father died 3 winters later, the mourning cloth was not yet pinned over the mirrors before keys changed hands. 6 months after his burial, Barbara laid her mother in the churchyard beside him and stood in sleet with mud soaking through both shoes, while Mrs. Wrexham waited in the carriage, unwilling to risk her hem. 3 days later, a solicitor arrived with documents already drafted: necessary settlements, temporary transfer, protective administration pending review. The language was respectable enough to pass in any drawing room. In practice, it meant Barbara's dowry disappeared into a line item no one could fully explain. Her signature appeared on papers she had never seen, and every object that held memory moved either to locked cabinets or to the bedrooms of girls who had never asked whom it belonged to first. By the 2nd week after the funeral, her mother's pearl comb sat in Clarissa Wrexham's hair at luncheon. By month's end, Imogen Wrexham had cut up Barbara's old riding habit for trimming and laughed when Barbara flinched at the sight. "You were far too plain for dark green," she had said, tugging the ribbon tight around a hatband. "It serves me better." Mrs. Wrexham heard the exchange and smiled without looking up from her correspondence. "Do not hover, Barbara. You are blocking the light." In the lecture room, that same voice floated back now, lower but no less sharp. "Do not stand where Lord Penrith can see your sleeves," Mrs. Wrexham murmured over her shoulder. "You look as if you have slept in a gutter." One daughter gave a breath of laughter. The other adjusted her fan and added, "She has no talent for appearance, only for sums." The words landed with the weight of practice. They had been saying versions of them for 3 years, in hallways, at breakfast, outside chapel, in carriages where glass and rain made a private cruelty feel almost civil. Barbara set her jaw and kept her eyes on the ledger stack, because shame was easier to bear when she gave it edges and counted them. Cruelty in that house was rarely theatrical. It was administrative. It arrived as altered meal times and missing coal scuttles, as laundry returned damp, so gowns mildewed in drawers, as orders delivered in front of guests, so refusal became performance and compliance became entertainment. Mrs. Wrexham withheld supper not in anger but in policy. "A young woman who confuses her station should not be encouraged," she told the cook one evening when Barbara had corrected an invoice at table and prevented an overcharge on imported sugar. The cook looked at Barbara, then at the floor, then served the others twice. There was always enough for those who pleased Mrs. Wrexham. There was bread heel and weak tea for the one who did not. Clarissa and Imogen learned quickly where power sat and reflected it with youthful precision. They borrowed without asking and returned torn seams with complaints. They sent Barbara across town in rain to fetch lace they later rejected as unfashionable. They called her into their rooms at midnight to rethread stays, and then told callers next morning that she had idled half the night reading. Once, in November, Clarissa spilled lamp oil on purpose across the nursery carpet and cried out for witnesses. When Barbara came running with sand, Imogen said, "There, she has done it again," and Mrs. Wrexham ordered Barbara to scrub the stain before dawn and attend breakfast with gloves on, so no guest would be offended by her hands. The household saw. No one intervened. Old Davies in the scullery pressed an apple into Barbara's apron when no one watched. Martha from the upstairs corridor left mending thread by her door. Kindness came in contraband gestures and vanished before it could be named. The larger thefts were cleaner. Her father's watch went to a jeweller for repair and never returned. Her mother's desk was emptied, then gifted to Imogen as a writing table. The portrait miniature Barbara kept wrapped in linen disappeared from her attic shelf, and when she asked, Mrs. Wrexham answered, "You are sentimental to a fault. Sentiment feeds no one." At Christmastide 2 years ago, Barbara came down in the same black wool she had worn since first morning, and found both stepsisters in gowns cut from bolts her father had purchased for her presentation season before he fell ill. Clarissa twirled once in front of the hall mirror and said, "We had to alter heavily. You are narrower than fashion permits." Mrs. Wrexham said, "Do stop looking as if you have been stabbed. Cloth is cloth." In public she softened none of it. At a musical in Brook Street, she introduced Barbara to a magistrate's wife as "my husband's plain child, useful with receipts." The wife nodded, then looked away, then looked back with a flicker of curiosity she hid too slowly. Barbara had learned that pattern as well. They mocked her face because they feared it in their own daughters. They dismissed her mind because they needed it after midnight. They called her burden while living from the estate her father had built, and she still balanced, line by line, in secret copies no one paid fairly. In the lecture hall the irony stood breathing distance away. Clarissa wore Barbara's mother's sapphires at her throat, reset in a bright amount, and pretended not to notice when candlelight struck them the exact blue of old winter sky. A week into June, after a morning of errands that began before dawn and ended after dark, Barbara had sat in her attic with wet shoes beside the grate and copied tenancy abstracts by candle stubs until the script blurred because the printer on Fleet Lane paid by accuracy, and she needed 2 shillings before month's end to keep herself from owing Mrs. Wrexham for pin money she had never requested. She did not copy for ambition. She copied for margin. Margin meant she could replace a broken needle without asking. Margin meant she could buy paper to line her soles. Margin meant that when Mrs. Wrexham threatened to send her north as unpaid companion to a cousin known for locking servants out after curfew, Barbara could answer, "As you wish," without begging. Dignity had become a ledger too, credit in small acts, debit in public humiliations, balance carried forward by force of will. Tonight that balance shook as the committee recited figures she knew were wrong in a way that would not remain abstract once frost came. Bracken Fell was not ink to her. She had walked those lower fields once with her father and watched children chase hens between stone walls, while women measured flour with the care of apothecaries. She knew how little stood between a corrected account and an empty table. On the dais, a speaker cleared his throat and announced projected surplus from column 4, and Barbara's pulse struck hard in her wrists. Surplus! The word rang false at once. Column 4 on district abstracts marked arrears carried from the previous quarter, not funds available for levy. Any first-year clerk would see it. Any honest steward would refuse to sign. She felt heat rise under her skin despite the chill still trapped in her sleeves. She heard her father again, not as memory softened by grief, but as instruction plain as chalk on slate. Truth costs. Measure the cost. Speak when silence costs more. Her fingers tightened around each other until the split knuckle opened fresh beneath the glove lining. She did not flinch. In front, Mrs. Wrexham leaned toward the daughter nearest her and whispered behind her fan, eyes fixed forward, posture immaculate. Barbara could not hear the words. She did not need to. She knew the shape of command before it was spoken aloud. The clerk repeated the figure. A gentleman in the second row nodded approval. Barbara drew one breath, then another, and lifted her gaze from the ledger to the dais, just as Mrs. Wrexham turned in her seat and began to beckon her forward. Mrs. Wrexham's gloved fingers curled twice in the air, impatient, and Barbara moved down the side aisle between chairs before anyone could turn to see whom that signal was for. The lecture had not yet formally begun. Men were still settling papers, clearing throats, adjusting cuffs. In that narrow pocket of movement, Mrs. Wrexham drew Barbara into the shadow beside a marble column where the candlelight thinned and the draught from the vestibule reached under silk skirts. Clarissa shifted her fan to hide her mouth. Imogen watched with open interest, as if waiting for a scene at the theatre. Mrs. Wrexham did not waste a breath. She took a folded note from the reticule at her wrist, pressed it hard into Barbara's palm, and closed Barbara's fingers over the seal until the wax edge bit skin. "You will deliver this to the Duke of Narland the moment his address concludes," she said. "Not before, not in front of the committee. You will ask for one private word and repeat exactly what I have written for you to remember. Mrs. Wrexham has personally reviewed the tenant relief accounts and confirms the surplus in column 4 is suitable for immediate levy." Say it precisely. Barbara felt the floor tilt in that small private way it did when danger arrived dressed as instruction. She knew those books. She had copied 2 of the district abstracts by candlelight 3 nights ago when one clerk sent them out for fair transcript. Column 4 was arrears carried forward, not surplus, not spendable. The levy under discussion would strip reserve grain from Brackenfell and from Locaster, both before Michaelmas. She opened her mouth. Mrs. Wrexham's nails tightened on her wrist. "No!" The single word was soft and flat. "You are here to carry, not to think. You have been indulged with numbers and now mistake that indulgence for authority." Clarissa's bracelets chimed when she leaned closer. "If she stammers, shall I do it instead?" "You will do nothing," Mrs. Wrexham said without looking at her daughter, eyes fixed on Barbara's face. "Barbara will earn her keep this evening." Her perfume sat heavy in the cold air, lavender over starch and powder. "If one syllable is altered, you will not return to my house tonight. A carriage will take you north to my cousin by dawn. You will serve her as companion without wage until I am satisfied this spirit has left you." The threat landed cleanly because it was practical. Mrs. Wrexham did not shout when she could arrange. She released Barbara's wrist and smoothed the crease she had made in Barbara's glove, as if correcting household linen. "You are pale. Pinch your cheeks before you approach his grace. Try not to look hungry." Then, with the rustle of costly silk, she turned back toward the front row and seated herself as though nothing had occurred. The bell sounded once from near the dais. Conversation narrowed. Quills were set ready. Barbara remained standing in the aisle's shadow with the note hidden in her right hand, and the ache of Mrs. Wrexham's grip blooming up her arm. She could still feel the outline of the seal through damp kid leather. Around her, breath and wool and coal smoke gathered under the chandeliers. A clerk crossed to the central table carrying 3 ledgers bound in red, then set them down with a blunt thud that echoed like a dropped verdict. The committee chairman announced the Duke of Norland in a voice meant for reverence, and men rose in a wave. Barbara rose with them because everyone did. She saw him first in fragments between shoulders and hats, a black coat cut to military severity, a white cravat tied with no flourish, dark hair brushed straight back from a face that looked carved rather than softened by living. When he stepped fully into view at the front of the room, he was taller than she had expected, and still in the manner of men who had never needed to hurry. The hall altered around that stillness. Even the late whispers ceased. He inclined his head once and began, without preamble, reviewing district allocations in clipped phrases, while clerks followed line by line. His voice was low and carried cleanly to the back wall. Barbara heard every number. She heard each transfer from one quarter to the next. She heard him arrive, at last, at the line that mattered. Column 4 indicates surplus retained after spring disbursement, he said, eyes on the summary sheet before him. The committee's recommendation for emergency levy is therefore sustainable through harvest. Sustainable. The word struck her like a physical blow. She felt her father's instruction rise through years of hunger and discipline with a force that made her throat tighten. Measure the cost. Speak when silence costs more. Mrs. Wrexham did not turn, but Barbara saw her left hand lift slightly, 2 fingers extended near her lap, warning and command in one small gesture. Barbara looked at the men seated near the front, at rings and signet seals and polished boots untouched by mud from Brackenfell lanes. She looked at the note in her fist, at the wax impression of Mrs. Wrexham's crest beginning to soften with her hand's heat. The clerk beside the dais repeated the Duke's line for record. "Surplus retained!" Her pulse hammered once, hard enough to sting in the split knuckle beneath her glove. Then she heard her own voice cross the room before fear could close it. "Your Grace, column 4 is arrears, not surplus. If enacted, this levy will starve Brackenfell by Michaelmas." Silence did not fall all at once. It snapped, chairs creaked and then stopped. One candle hissed in its socket. At the front, the Duke lifted his head from the paper and looked straight toward the back rows where servants stood and did not speak. Who said that? It was not a question shaped for politeness. Barbara stepped into the aisle where he could see her fully, hatless, sleeves rain-marked, hem dark with drying water. Every gaze in the hall found her at once. Mrs. Wrexham half rose. "Your Grace, forgive her, she is—" He raised one hand without turning. Mrs. Wrexham sat. Barbara could hear the blood in her ears. "I spoke, Your Grace," she said. "Barbara McCarthy." The Duke's eyes held on her face for a beat, then dropped, taking in details with brutal efficiency. The worn cuff, the tremor she could not still now, the hand closed too tightly around something hidden. "On what basis do you challenge committee figures, Miss McCarthy?" The title from his mouth felt less like courtesy than exact notation. "On the basis of the district abstracts submitted Tuesday," she said. "Column 4 carries winter arrears and unpaid seed credit. It does not mark liquid reserve. The headings were transposed in the summary copy." A murmur ran through the benches. The chairman sputtered, "This is highly irregular." "Irregular is an incorrect levy," the Duke said. He looked to the clerks. "Bring the original abstracts for Brackenfell and Locaster. Now." 2 men moved at once, one nearly overturning an inkwell in his haste. The Duke stepped down from the dais before anyone could object and stopped 3 paces from Barbara in the aisle, close enough that she could see a faint scar near his left temple where hair had not fully concealed it. Up close he seemed colder, not in temperature but in restraint. "Give me what is in your hand," he said. She hesitated. The room watched her hesitate. "It is a note from Mrs. Wrexham, Your Grace." "Give it!" Barbara placed the folded paper in his palm. He glanced at the seal, unreadable, then handed it to a waiting footman without breaking wax. "Return this to Mrs. Wrexham unopened." The footman bowed and moved. A gasp, quickly smothered, came from Clarissa's roar. The Duke's gaze returned to Barbara. "Were you instructed to deliver that privately?" "Yes, Your Grace." "To support the summary as read?" "Yes." For the first time his mouth altered by a fraction. Not warmth. Recognition sharpened into decision. "You are shaking." "I am cold, Your Grace." "You are also hungry." The words struck deeper because they were true and spoken without softness. Heat rose in her face despite the chill in her sleeves. "I am sufficient for standing." His jaw tightened as if at pain he wouldn't name. That was not the question. By the 4th week of June, Barbara had learned that public rooms could become dangerous in a single sentence. But she had never seen one turn this quickly against those who had controlled it an hour before. The clerks returned carrying 2 ledgers and a sheaf of loose abstracts tied with twine. The Duke took them himself, resting one volume on the edge of a chair, turning pages with a speed that made clear he had done his own reading long before tonight. He found the heading, then the corresponding line, then held the book toward the chairman without relinquishing it. "Read column 4 aloud," the chairman swallowed. "Arrears, winter quarter." "Again, for the record." The man repeated it, voice thinner this time. A second committee member reached for the summary sheet, then stopped when the Duke looked at him. "Who prepared this transposed copy?" No one answered. Mrs. Wrexham rose with controlled grace. "Your Grace, if there has been any clerical confusion, I am certain—" "Sit down." She sat. The Duke did not raise his voice. He turned to the room. "The recommendation is suspended. No levy order is to leave this hall tonight. Clerk, strike the previous entry." Quill scratched. Wax dripped. Someone at the back exhaled audibly, like a man surfacing. Barbara remained where she stood because her knees had gone uncertain, and because moving now felt like surrender to panic. The Duke closed the ledger and handed it back. "Miss McCarthy, remain." Mrs. Wrexham was already on her feet again, smile fixed so tightly it looked painful. "Barbara is under my care, Your Grace. She has duties." "Miss McCarthy will remain," he repeated, and the room understood that this was no longer a negotiation between ladies over household authority. Clarissa stared at Barbara with bright hatred. Imogen looked frightened for the first time that evening. The Duke inclined his head toward the side table where water stood in cut glass. "Drink." Barbara didn't move, he added. "That is an instruction." She crossed the 2 steps, set her shaking hand around the tumbler, and drank. The water tasted of tin and stone. When she set it down, the Duke spoke without looking at her, eyes on the committee papers being gathered in disarray. "Why did you correct me?" She could have chosen safety then. She could have said confusion. She could have said she misspoke. Instead, she heard her father again and answered the same way she had answered at 14, over a ledger error no one else had seen. "Because it was false, Your Grace." He turned his head. The candlelight caught in eyes the colour of storm water. "And because—" Barbara felt every gaze in the hall lean toward her answer. "And because children in Brackenfell cannot eat corrected minutes after winter," she said. His expression did not soften. It settled. "Very well." He stepped back toward the dais and addressed the clerks. "Dismiss the committee. Retain the originals. I will review every district submission myself before dawn." Chairs scraped, men rose, conversations began in urgent low bursts that stopped when he looked their way. Mrs. Wrexham reached Barbara first, fingers biting into her elbow hard enough to bruise through wet fabric. "You reckless girl," she whispered through smiling teeth. "You have ended us." The Duke's voice crossed the distance at once. "Release her." Mrs. Wrexham let go as if burned, turned, and curtsied with practised composure. "Of course, Your Grace, she is overwrought." "No," he said, "she is accurate." He held Barbara's gaze over Mrs. Wrexham's shoulder, and for one suspended breath the vast room, the chandeliers, the rustle of silk, the rank and scent and cold all narrowed to the space between his next command and her ability to obey it. "Miss McCarthy, do not leave this hall." The order held her in place more effectively than Mrs. Wrexham's hand ever had. People were already moving around her in eddies of silk and dark wool, voices pitched low and urgent, the kind of whispers that shaped tomorrow's ruin before midnight had struck. A clerk passed with an armful of ledgers. Another carried sand to blot a spoiled line in the minutes. At the front, the Duke stood with one gloved hand on the back of a chair, listening to 3 men at once and answering none of them until each had finished. His stillness made their agitation look childish. Mrs. Wrexham returned to Barbara's side with a smile arranged for witnesses and eyes sharp as pins. "You will come with me now," she said. Barbara kept her hands folded to hide the tremor. "His Grace instructed me to remain." Mrs. Wrexham's smile did not alter. "His Grace is occupied. You are confused." "I am not confused." Clarissa drifted close enough for her skirts to brush Barbara's wet hem. "Do not pretend at consequence. You spoke out of turn. You always do when you're hungry." Imogen gave a brittle laugh. "If you faint, at least do it where no one must step around you." Barbara did not look at either sister. She watched the Duke across the room, because he had not looked back once since giving the order, and because that strangely made the order feel firmer. Mrs. Wrexham followed her line of sight and lowered her voice. "If you force me to drag you from this room, I shall do it. Do not test me in public." A footman appeared at Barbara's elbow with a dark wool mantle folded over both arms. He was not Wrexham staff. Norland colours marked the cuff. He bowed to Barbara, not to Mrs. Wrexham. "His Grace directs that you put this on, miss." Mrs. Wrexham turned toward him, all offended rank. "She has no need—" "His Grace directed it, my lady." The footman did not raise his voice. He did not move his eyes from Barbara. She took the mantle. The wool was dry and heavy and warm from indoor air. When she settled it around her shoulders, sensation returned to her fingers in painful needles. Mrs. Wrexham went very still, then stepped back half a pace, as if calculation required room. By the time the great clock in the vestibule struck the quarter hour, most of the audience had gone. Only committee members remained, plus clerks, 2 footmen, and a magistrate summoned from an adjoining society room where he had been cataloguing charitable trusts. He arrived in haste, wig askew, ink on his thumb, and looked annoyed until someone said the Duke's name. Then he looked alert. The Duke crossed to the central table and spoke without preamble. "Mr. Hale, we require immediate notation of a disputed account submission and witness statements while memory is fresh." The magistrate bowed. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I record a clerical correction only, or allegations of fraudulent intent?" "Record facts first." His gaze shifted to Barbara. "Miss McCarthy, step forward." She did. The boards felt uneven under her damp shoes. Her stomach cramped again, sharp enough to fold her if she let it, but she stood straight. Mrs. Wrexham stayed near the second row, one hand on Clarissa's sleeve, The other wrapped around her fan so tightly the ivory ribs creaked. Mr. Hale settled at the table with fresh paper. Name, age, residence. Barbara McCarthy, 22, Wrexham House, Grosvenor Square. Occupation. A pause opened. Mrs. Wrexham's mouth twitched. Barbara said, household dependent, copyist of account abstracts when contracted. The magistrate's quill moved. State, in plain terms, the nature of your correction. Barbara fixed her eyes on the ledger edge and let numbers arrange themselves as they always did when panic threatened. The summary sheet read column 4 as surplus retained after spring disbursement. In the district abstracts for Brackenfell and Locaster, column 4 is labelled arrears carried forward, including unpaid seed credit and winter relief advances. If treated as surplus and levied, those sums would be removed from already obligated balances. Mr. Hale looked up. You are certain of the source documents? Yes. How? I copied 2 of them Tuesday evening from Clark Draft. Paid by whom? Mr. Pendle on Fleet Lane. One committee man snorted. A printer's girl now instructs the room on estate finance. The Duke turned his head. Nothing more. The man fell silent. Mr. Hale resumed, did anyone instruct you to make this correction publicly? No. Did anyone instruct you to remain silent? Barbara's fingers tightened under the mantle. She could feel Mrs. Wrexham's gaze like heat on skin. Yes. Name. Mrs. Wrexham moved before Barbara could answer, gliding toward the table with hands open in gentle protest. Mr. Hale, surely this has gone far enough. The girl is overwrought and not equal to formal examination. She has not dined. She confuses private household conversation with public instruction. The Duke did not look at her. Lady Wrexham, stand where you are. Mrs. Wrexham stopped. For one instant, naked fury crossed her face before she smoothed it flat again. Barbara heard her own voice, steady from somewhere she had not known, remained untouched. Mrs. Wrexham instructed me in the aisle to deliver a note to your Grace and repeat that she had personally reviewed the accounts and confirmed surplus in column 4. Mr. Hale's quills scratched faster. Where is this note? A Norland footman stepped forward and placed it on the table. The wax seal was intact. Mr. Hale looked to the Duke for permission. The Duke gave one short nod. The magistrate broke the seal, unfolded the paper and read in silence. His brows rose. He passed it to the Duke. The Duke read once and set it down. To the record, Mr. Hale said carefully. The note repeats the statement Miss McCarthy has just described. Clarissa made a small sound, almost a gasp. Imogen caught her wrist hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Mrs. Wrexham lifted her chin. I prepared a speaking note from summaries provided to me. If those summaries were transposed, then I too was misled. One of the committee members seized that line at once. There then, clerical confusion all around, no malice. We can close this cleanly. He turned toward Barbara with practised patience, as one might address a stubborn child. Miss McCarthy, you need only say you were mistaken in tone and place, not in essence. We shall issue a revised notice and spare reputations. The offer hung in the room, polished and poisonous, a correction without blame. Safety purchased by bending truth 1 degree. Barbara felt, with sudden clarity, the cost of each possible answer. If she accepted, Brackenfell might still be spared this levy, perhaps, but the forged authority would remain. The same hands would write the next summary. The same silence would be required from her again and again, until she had none left. She said, I was not mistaken in tone or place. The recommendation was moments from record. The man's mouth tightened. You are eager to be dramatic. I'm eager for the heading to match the number. The magistrate's head dipped, almost approval. Then he masked it with professional neutrality. Did you at any point coordinate your correction with His Grace? No. Did His Grace coach your language? No. Did he in any way prompt this intervention? No. Lord Penrith, red-faced and affronted, leaned over the bench. Convenient! A duke embarrassed by his own committee and rescued by a house drudge with perfect recall. Barbara turned toward him before fear could stop her. Your lordship, His Grace had not spoken to me before this evening. He read what was placed before him. I corrected what was placed before him. If there is embarrassment, it belongs to the hand that altered the headings. The room went quiet again, deeper this time. She had not raised her voice. She had merely set the sentence down and stepped back from it. At the edge of her vision, she saw the Duke's profile sharpen. He remained where he was, near the fireplace, one shoulder against carved stone, watching without interruption. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. Miss McCarthy, do you possess any physical copies of the Tuesday drafts you mention? Yes. Where? In my attic trunk, wrapped in blue paper, under mending linen. Mrs. Wrexham snapped. You removed household papers from the premises. Barbara faced forward. I copied contracted pages. Carbon impressions remained on my blotter sheets. I kept them because the totals did not reconcile. The magistrate looked from Barbara to the Duke. Those impressions could be probative if authenticated against Clark Hand. The Duke answered at once. You will send an officer to Wrexham House tonight. Miss McCarthy will identify the packet. Mrs. Wrexham laughed, short and incredulous. This is absurd. You would dispatch officers on the testimony of a dependent girl with grievances. The Duke's voice stayed level. On the basis of documentary conflict and a written note in your hand directing false representation to this committee. Mrs. Wrexham took one step toward Barbara, fan clenched like a blade. You spiteful little... Stop! The word from the Duke struck the room and held it. Mrs. Wrexham froze. He pushed away from the fireplace and came to the table. Up close, the scar at his temple pulled faintly when his jaw tightened. He addressed Mr. Hale. Record that Lady Wrexham attempted to influence witness testimony during examination. He looked at Barbara then directly, and the cold precision in his face shifted by a degree into something harder to bear. Miss McCarthy, if retrieving those papers places you at risk in that house, say so now. Every eye returned to her. She could feel sweat cooling at the base of her neck, under the borrowed wool. This was the moment she had avoided for 3 years. Say yes, and she would have no roof by morning unless strangers proved kinder than family. Say no, and evidence could vanish before dawn. She answered as she had trained herself to answer when lying would cost more. Yes, Your Grace. The word landed soft and final. The magistrate set his quill down and rubbed ink from his fingers. Then we proceed with escort. I can issue immediate authority for document preservation pending review. One committee man muttered, For God's sake, over household squabbles. Barbara spoke before anyone else could. It is not a household squabble. It is tenant grain, forged attribution, and missing settlements tied to my father's estate. The phrase missing settlements made the Duke's eyes narrow. Explain, Barbara swallowed. Her throat was dry again, despite the water. My dowry transfer papers were executed during my mother's fever period. Signatures attributed to me do not match my hand. I have asked twice for review and been denied access to originals. Mrs. Wrexham's composure cracked. You ungrateful child! I fed you! I clothed you! You used my mother's mourning allowance to buy Clarissa's Paris silk. Clarissa flushed dark pink and looked at the floor. Imogen whispered, Barbara, be silent. Barbara did not look at her. You sold my father's watch as repair scrap and called it prudent administration. Mrs. Wrexham lifted her hand as if to strike. The Duke stepped between them in one movement, not hurried, not dramatic, simply absolute. Mrs. Wrexham's hand remained raised for a beat, then dropped. "Touch her again," he said, "and you answer to me." No one spoke. Even the clerks had stopped pretending to organise papers. "Mr.?" Hale recovered first. "Lady Wrexham, given statements entered and note produced, I advise you not to leave London until preliminary review concludes." "You cannot confine me on this nonsense. I can require availability and secure financial documents under seal." Her eyes darted toward the side door, calculating flight, influence, witnesses. She found none willing to meet her gaze. The Duke turned to Barbara, and when he spoke, it was a command shaped as protection. "You will sit. I can stand. You are bleeding through your glove." She looked down. A dark line had seeped along the seam where her split knuckle had reopened. She had not felt it happen. A maid from the vestibule appeared with a basin and clean cloth, summoned by someone Barbara had not seen move. Barbara lowered herself to a chair because her knees had begun to shake in earnest now that the speaking was done. Mr. Hale resumed his record with brisk precision. He listed the note, the transposed summary, the corrected headings, the allegation of coerced testimony, the pending retrieval of blotter impressions, the claim regarding settlement signatures. Each item was read back aloud. Each was affirmed. The words became weight on paper. Paper became process. Process, for once, might become consequence. Outside, rain tapped again at the high windows. The hall smelled of wet stone and cooling wax. Most candles had burned down to stubs. Time had thinned the room to essentials. Truth stated, lies recorded, choices fixed. By 11:30, an officer from Bow Street arrived with 2 constables in plain coats. Mr. Hale handed over a written warrant for document preservation. The officer, square-faced and tired, read quickly and nodded. "Miss McCarthy, you will accompany us to identify materials." Mrs. Wrexham took one swift step forward. "She is not leaving with common runners." The Duke did not turn toward her. "She leaves under my authority and Mr. Hale's warrant." The officer touched the brim of his hat. "We move now, miss, if you are able." Barbara rose. The room tilted once and steadied. She gathered the borrowed mantle close. Her hand throbbed where the cloth had been wrapped, but the pain felt almost useful, a clear edge after hours of dread. As she passed the second row, Imogen caught her sleeve lightly. "Not malice, fear." "Barbara," she whispered, "if this proceeds, we are all ruined." Barbara looked at her sister's fine gloves, at the sapphire pendant resting in the hollow of her throat, at the face that had watched and echoed and never once intervened. "You were not ruined when I was hungry," she said quietly. Imogen let go. At the vestibule doors, the Duke spoke from behind her. "Miss McCarthy." She turned. He stood in the spill of chandelier light, broad shoulders cutting a dark line against gilded plaster, expression unreadable except for the tension at the mouth. "You will return here after the warrant is executed." It was not a request. Barbara held his gaze. "If I am permitted to leave the house again—" His answer came without pause. "You are permitted." The constables opened the door. Cold rain air rushed in, sharp as metal. Barbara stepped into it between law officers, and under a mantle that was not hers, carrying at last the one thing no one in that house had ever let her keep for long, her own unaltered word. Rain struck her face the instant she crossed the threshold, cold and fine as filings. A constable lifted a hooded lantern. The light swung over wet cobbles, carriage wheels, and the dark flank of a waiting coach marked with no crest. Barbara gathered the borrowed mantle tighter and stepped down the slick stone with care. Her split knuckle throbbed through the cloth binding. Behind her the hall doors had not yet closed. She could still feel the heat of chandeliers on her back, while rain soaked the hem at her ankles. The officer at her right glanced toward the carriage, and then straightened abruptly. Barbara followed his line of sight. The Duke of Norland came down the steps without hat or cloak, rain already darkening his shoulders. "Your Grace," the Bow Street man said, startled, "there is no need for you to attend." "There is," the Duke said. He stopped beside Barbara, close enough that she felt the heat of him through wet wool. Water ran from his hair to the line of his jaw. He did not seem to notice. He looked at the officer. "You have the warrant?" "Yes, sir." "You will execute it in full. No papers left unsecured, no private conferences, no delays." The officer nodded. "Understood." Barbara turned toward him despite herself. "Your Grace, you need not stand in rain for household papers." His gaze cut to her face. "Get in the carriage." It should have felt like domination. It landed as shelter. She climbed in first, then one constable, then the officer with the warrant case. The Duke entered last and took the forward seat opposite her. He sat without speaking, while the door slammed and the coach lurched into motion. Rain drummed the roof. The lantern outside threw moving bars of light across his cheekbones and the scar at his temple. No one spoke for several streets. The constable smelled of wet leather and tobacco. The officer checked the warrant twice. Thumb pressed hard at the magistrate's seal each time as if to reassure himself it still existed. Barbara kept her wounded hand hidden in the mantlefold. Her fingers had begun to shake again, not from cold now, but from the knowledge that each turn of the wheel took them nearer the attic trunk and everything she had kept against this exact night. At the corner of Piccadilly, the carriage jolted hard over a rut. Her hand slipped from the fold. The bandage, already thinned by rain, had reddened at the seam. The Duke's eyes dropped at once. "You are bleeding again." "It is slight." "Liar." The word was low and clean. Not insult, assessment. She looked up, startled by the bluntness. He held her gaze without apology. "Your glove was soaked through before we left the hall," he said. "You kept your hand closed to hide it. You do that when you are in pain." The officer across from her lowered his eyes at once, as if he had walked into a private chamber by mistake. Barbara felt heat rise under her skin despite the cold air leaking through the doorframe. "You have observed too much, Your Grace." "I have observed enough." The carriage rolled on. He did not look away. By the time they reached Grosvenor Square, the rain had thickened from mist to steady silver lines in the lamplight. Wrexham House stood dark on the upper floors, bright below stairs where servants had been kept wakeful for returning ladies. The porter opened at the warrant's first knock, saw uniforms and the Duke's face behind them, and stepped back so quickly he struck the umbrella stand. The officer entered first. "By authority of Mr. Hale and magistrate's seal, no documents are to be removed or destroyed. Summon senior household staff to the morning room." A maid fled toward the rear corridor. Another stood frozen with a coal scuttle in both hands. Barbara crossed the hall she had crossed 1,000 nights, now with wet footprints and law at her shoulder. The portraits seemed to watch from gilded frames, her father among them, half in shadow above the stair turn. She did not pause. "Attic stair," she said. "Third landing, left passage, last door." One constable remained below to secure entries. The officer, the second constable, and the Duke followed her up. Each step creaked in a pattern she knew by memory. At the second landing the carpet ended. At the third the air turned sharply colder and smelled of slate and old dust. Her door stuck in damp weather. She set her shoulder to it, and it opened with a dry snap. The room was as she had left it at dawn. Narrow bed, one chair, cracked basin, shoes lined with folded paper drying near the dead grate, her copied columns stacked under a chipped inkstone. Nothing in it looked like theft until one knew what had been taken from her to make this room possible. The officer lifted the lantern. "Identify the packet." Barbara crossed to the trunk at the bed's foot and knelt. The lock was a simple clasp, never worth replacing because no one in the house had imagined she possessed anything worth stealing. She opened it, mending linen, 2 plain chemises, her father's shorthand manuals wrapped in oilcloth. At the bottom, blue paper tied with string. She lifted it with both hands. "This!" The officer took the bundle carefully and set it on the chair. He untied it, revealing blotter sheets, reverse impressions, and 2 copied abstracts with Clark initials in the margin. He spread the first sheet under lantern light and swore softly without profanity, the sound of a man realizing the night had shifted from inconvenience to casework. "These are legible," he said, "more than legible." He began inventory in a formal voice, each item numbered aloud while the constable repeated and wrote, "1 packet blue paper containing blotter impressions of district accounts, 2 copied abstracts marked Tuesday date, 1 shorthand notebook, initials BM." Barbara hesitated at the notebook, then placed it atop the pile. "My father's cross-reference key is in the back pages. It links steward marks to settlement drafts." The officer looked up sharply. "Settlement drafts! Yes!" She reached deeper into the trunk beneath a folded shawl and withdrew a narrow envelope patched at one corner. "These are copies of transfer notices sent after my mother fell ill. The signatures attributed to me are not mine." He opened one document, compared the signature line to a note on the trunk lid where Barbara had once tested a pen. Even in poor light the difference was plain. "All of it goes under seal," he said. "All of it tonight." Through it all the Duke had not moved from the doorway. He stood with one hand braced on the frame, shoulders nearly filling it, rainwater still drying in dark lines down his coat. He watched the inventory with a stillness that felt more intense than movement. When Barbara rose from the trunk, her knees unsteady, she saw his eyes travel once around the room, the patched blanket, the cracked wash jug, the crust of yesterday's bread wrapped in paper on the sill where damp had reached it. His jaw tightened. The scar at his temple pulled. He said nothing. Downstairs a carriage clattered into the square and stopped hard. Voices rose in the hall below, high and panicked. Clarissa first, then Imogen, then the unmistakable clipped edge of Mrs. Wrexham trying to turn panic into command. The officer looked toward the passage. "We should clear this level before confrontation." "No," the Duke said. "You continue." Footsteps struck the stair in a rush. Mrs. Wrexham appeared in the attic corridor with her daughters behind her, gowns lifted from the wet, pearls bright at the throat as if this were another call night and not legal seizure. She halted when she saw the open trunk and papers on the chair. "What is this outrage?" she said. "Who permitted entry to private family rooms?" The officer held up the warrant. "Magistrate's authority. Document preservation." She ignored him and fixed on Barbara. "You brought armed men into this house, into your mother's rooms." "My mother never slept under broken slate," Barbara said. Clarissa made a small noise of disgust. "Must she always perform?" Imogen's eyes moved from the papers to Barbara's face and back again. Fear hollowed her expression. Mrs. Wrexham took one step forward. The Duke did not raise his voice. "Do not come closer." She stopped. "Your Grace, this is a domestic misunderstanding amplified by a resentful girl." He answered without looking at her. The misunderstanding includes a forged attribution note in your hand and transposed ledgers tied to public levy. I wrote from summaries given to me. You wrote authority you did not hold. At last he turned. His gaze was winter-flat. You also struck her tonight in a carriage, according to 2 witnesses. Mrs. Wrexham's colour changed by a degree. Family correction is not criminal battery. No, he said, it is evidence. Silence snapped across the landing. Clarissa stared at her mother as if hearing a language she did not know. Imogen gripped the banister with both hands. The officer cleared his throat. Lady Wrexham, until review concludes, these materials are seized. Any interference will be recorded as obstruction. Mrs. Wrexham drew herself up. You cannot mean to leave this girl in my house after this insult. The Duke's head turned back toward Barbara. When he spoke, each word landed like a seal pressed into wax. She will not remain here. Barbara's breath caught. Your Grace! He cut across her softly, not taking his eyes from her face. No. It was the same single syllable she had heard from her stepmother in aisles and corridors for 3 years. In his mouth it meant the opposite. You will not sleep under this roof tonight, he said, or any night while this inquiry stands. Mrs. Wrexham laughed once, sharp. And where, pray, will she go? To your bachelor residence? To feed gossip from Westminster to Hyde Park? The Duke did not so much as glance her way. Mrs. Davies waits at Norland House. She has prepared rooms. Barbara stared at him. You arranged this already. Yes. When? At the hall, when Hale read the note. The crack came then, not in volume, but in irreversibility. He had not merely reacted, he had acted ahead, placing protection before permission, structure before sentiment. She felt the floor shift under old assumptions. You had no right, she said, low enough that only he could hear. He stepped 1 pace into the room, rain and cold and authority entering with him. You are correct. The admission struck harder than denial. I had no right to wait this long either, he said. I watched you leave church on half rations. I watched you carry parcels in rain while your household rode dry. I watched bruises appear and vanish under cuffs. I told myself I required proof before intervention. Tonight you provided it. I will not require it again. The words did not sound like courtship. They sounded like judgment passed on himself. Behind him the officer tied the seized bundle with fresh cord and pressed wax over the knot. The constable stamped the seal. Physical evidence, itemised and bound, passed from Barbara's trunk into law. Mrs. Wrexham hissed, "This is coercion." Barbara turned to her, suddenly calm. "No, coercion was when you threatened to send me north if I spoke truth." Clarissa's face blanched. Imogen closed her eyes. The Duke extended his hand, not touching, waiting. "Miss McCarthy, come." She looked at that hand for one suspended beat. Not intimacy. Exit. She took it because her knees had begun to fail and because refusing now would be obedience to the wrong person in a new form. He released her at once when she steadied, as if he knew exactly how long contact could last before becoming claim. Then he gave instructions with military precision. 1 constable to remain at Wrexham House until dawn, all account cabinets sealed, no trunks removed, Mrs. Wrexham and daughters confined to public rooms pending further order from Mr. Hale. Each command was acknowledged, each command written down. By the first bell after midnight, Barbara stood again in the lower hall with her small trunk, the seized packet gone ahead under official seal, and Mrs. Wrexham rigid beside the stair, silk rustling like dry leaves. "You are ungrateful to the end," Mrs. Wrexham said. Barbara met her eyes. "No, I have finished paying." She turned before reply could come. Outside, rain had eased to a thin, steady fall. The Norland carriage waited with lamps lit. Mrs. Davies, grey-haired and straight-backed, sat inside with a blanket, and dry gloves laid ready. She looked at Barbara once, took in wet hem, bound hand, hollow face, and simply moved aside to make room. The Duke remained on the pavement while Barbara climbed in. He did not step closer than courtesy allowed. Water beaded on his coat collar. He looked up at her through the open door. A Bow Street officer stepped to the door and handed up a folded paper. By written instruction of Mr. Hale, evidence is to be reported tonight, and Miss McCarthy's return to the hall is deferred for the hour and her safety. Supplemental statement at 9 tomorrow morning. Tomorrow you will give full statement to Hale, the Duke said. Then you will eat. Then you will sleep. The order was plain. The care inside it was plainer. Barbara held the blanket in her lap and answered in the same formal register that had carried her through humiliation and testimony both. Yes, Your Grace. His mouth shifted by a fraction, not quite a smile. Good, he said. Do not apologise for being accurate again. The door closed. The carriage moved. Through rain-dimmed glass, she saw him still standing where she had left him, one hand bare at his side, not turning back toward the hall until her coach had cleared the square. The carriage turned into Norland Mews and stopped beneath a stone arch where 2 lamps burned steady against the rain. Barbara stepped down with stiff legs and the blanket still around her shoulders. Mrs. Davies took the small trunk before any footman could touch it and led Barbara through a side entrance warmed by coal and beeswax. The change in air made Barbara dizzy. Heat reached her hands and lit every cut at once. She swayed. Mrs. Davies set a firm palm at her back. Kitchen first, Miss McCarthy. Statements can wait 10 minutes. Blood cannot. Barbara opened her mouth to refuse and found she had no strength for the old courtesy. She let herself be guided to a narrow room behind the main hall, where a kettle sang and bread steamed when cut. Mrs. Davies unwound the soaked bandage, cleaned the split knuckle with water that stung like fire, and wrapped it in fresh linen. A plate appeared. Broth, half a heel of brown loaf, cold chicken sliced thin. Barbara managed 3 spoonfuls before her throat closed. Mrs. Davies did not press. She only moved the candle closer and watched Barbara with eyes that had seen many women sit upright by force long after they should have rested. A knock sounded at the kitchen door. One of Norland's clerks entered with a sealed paper. From Bow Street, ma'am, for Miss McCarthy. Officer Trent requests acknowledgement that the evidence reached lockbox and was entered at 1:20. Barbara took the paper. The wax bore the magistrate's mark. She broke it with her thumb and read the short line twice. Packet blue paper, blotter impressions, copied abstracts, shorthand notebook, transfer notices, received intact, logged and sealed in Hale custody. She signed her name beneath the receipt line with a hand that shook, then handed it back. Mrs. Davies saw the motion and nodded once. Good, nothing vanishes tonight. At 9 the next morning, rain had thinned to mist, and the city smelled of wet brick and coal smoke. Barbara sat in Mr. Hale's chamber with the Duke 2 chairs away and 3 clerks at a side table ready to compare hands and headings. The room was plain, ink, law books, a fire burning low. Officer Trent stood by the door with the evidence box open under supervision. Each item came out in order, read aloud, and laid flat on blotting boards. Mr. Hale tapped the first abstract. Clerk initials match registry. A committee clerk, pale and resentful, leaned over the sheet. Yes, that is mine. Hale passed him the transposed summary. And this heading? The man swallowed. Not mine. Whose? A long pause, then copied in Lady Wrexham's drawing room from my ruff by her instruction. her house steward present. Barbara felt the room settle around that sentence. No drama, only placement of fact. Mr. Hale moved to the transfer notices. Signature line attributed to Miss McCarthy. Miss McCarthy, produce a contemporaneous sample. Barbara wrote her name 3 times on fresh paper, then opened her father's shorthand notebook to an old page, where she had signed as witness to a tenant remission 2 years earlier. Hale compared loops, pressure, terminal stroke. He passed both to the document examiner, an older man with spectacles thick as bottle glass. The examiner took one look and spoke without ornament. These settlement signatures are simulated. Same direction errors in all 3. Forger copied letter shape, not hand rhythm. The Duke's fingers, resting on the chair arm, tightened once and released. Mr. Hale marked the docket. Forgery established pending formal filing. Officer Trent cleared his throat. Additional report, sir. Account cabinets at Wrexham House were sealed at 2:10. Keys recovered from Lady Wrexham's reticule. One attempt to access East Cabinet by Miss Clarissa Wrexham at 3:40, prevented by constable on post. Clarissa had given Barbara a bright, poisonous look in the attic and said nothing. She said nothing now. She had declined appearance and sent no statement. Her silence was entered as refusal. Imogen did appear. She came in a plain day dress, without jewels, and kept her gloves on until Hale asked for her hand to swear testimony. Her eyes did not meet Barbara's. State what you observed in the carriage last evening. Imogen's voice was thin. My mother struck Barbara across the wrist and told her one more contradiction would ruin us all. She said the note must be delivered as written. Did you ever see Miss McCarthy sign the transfer papers at issue? No. Did your mother claim she had? She said signatures were a housekeeping matter and none of my concern. When Hale dismissed her, Imogen looked once toward Barbara with the same fear she had worn on the attic landing. It held apology and self-preservation in equal measure. She did not speak. Barbara noted the absence and let it stand. Not every look in that house had ever become words. By late afternoon, the orders were signed in full session. Lady Wrexham was charged with fraud, coercion of testimony, and assault pending hearing. She was removed from authority at once and directed to vacate Wrexham House under officer supervision. The house itself was placed in temporary trust. Barbara's inheritance claim, with forged signatures voided, was restored under court seal until final probate confirmation. Mr. Hale pressed the seal in red wax and pushed the document across the desk. Miss McCarthy, read before you sign. No haste. She read every line. She amended one phrase with permission so that her mother's memorial allowance could not again be diverted under domestic administration. Hale initialed the correction, then Barbara signed. Her hand was steady. When she left the chamber, the Duke waited in the corridor beside a tall window streaked with rain. He wore the same black coat, dried and brushed, and looked as if he had not slept. It is done, she said. It has begun, he answered. Done comes when tenants are protected in writing and paid grain reaches bracken fell before frost. She had expected relief to feel like warmth. It felt like space to breathe and an ache where terror had lived too long. She met his eyes. Then we finish it. 3 days later, in the long library at Norland House, they sat across a table covered in draft agreements. Not courtship letters, not poetry. Tenant covenants, wage guarantees, winter reserve minimums, and an estate board structure that required 2 signatures for levy actions, one of them hers if she accepted a future role in the household. The Duke's solicitor read each clause aloud. Barbara stopped him twice, once for a loophole in emergency exceptions, once for language that allowed stewards to classify seed credit as discretionary. Strike discretionary, she said. Replace with obligated. The solicitor glanced to the Duke. The Duke said, "As she instructs." The final paper was shorter. A marriage settlement, jointure protection, independent pin money, not revocable by husband authority. Barbara read to the last line and set the pages down. "I will not be purchased as gratitude," she said. His answer came at once. "You are not purchasable. I will not enter any house where my word can be overruled by mood." "It will be overruled only by better evidence." She held his gaze for a long breath. "And Bracken fell. First convoy leaves at dawn. You will inspect it yourself if you wish." "I do wish." His mouth shifted by a fraction, that rare, almost smile she had seen once through rain and once through anger. "Good." She signed the tenant protections first. He signed beneath her. She signed the settlement second. He signed last, and sanded the ink himself. No one spoke for a moment after the pen was set down. The silence was not emptiness. It was a door closing on an old order. On the morning of the convoy, Barbara stood in the yard wrapped in a dark cloak and watching grain carts loaded under written tally and sealed by both steward and magistrate's runner. She checked the figures against the manifest with her father's shorthand key at her elbow. Nothing transposed, nothing hidden. When one sack count came up short, she marked it, and the missing sack was found on the third wagon beneath canvas. The foreman apologised. She nodded once and amended the line. By Michaelmas, the formal hearing ended. Lady Wrexham's social circle withdrew before the sentence did. She left London for a reduced lodging in Bath under supervision, and without access to the estate accounts she had once ruled by perfume and keys. Clarissa married a distant baronet within a month and never wrote. Imogen sent one letter in a cramped hand, admitting she had watched more than she had dared to say. Barbara read it by window light, then placed it in the drawer with documents that mattered and those that did not. The wedding was quiet, held in the parish chapel near Norland House, with Mrs. Davies as witness and Mr. Hale grimly satisfied in the rear pew. No spectacle, no orchestra, rain on stone and candlelight on polished wood. At breakfast after, one elderly relation of the Duke's muttered that he had married beneath his rank. The room waited. The Duke set down his cup, rose, and answered in the same voice he used for orders that were also law. "Good, I married her." No one challenged him again. That evening, when the last guest had gone and the house had settled, Barbara stood in the former steward's office that had been cleared for her work table. The restored ledgers lay in ordered stacks. Her father's watch, recovered from a pawnbroker by warrant and returned by Hale with dry formality, ticked beside the lamp. Through the open door she could hear the Duke in the corridor giving final instructions for winter inspections, each sentence clipped, each detail exact. He paused at the threshold and looked at her ink-stained fingers, the sealed books, the lamp, the chair drawn for two instead of one. "No one will silence you here," he said. Barbara touched the watch once, then met his winter-coloured eyes without lowering hers. "They will not need to," she said.